Gewurtz, which I rarely do publicly, but I really wanted to do that to situate my relationship with Paraskeva Clark's work, since this is really a cabinet exhibition that stems from my doctoral research. So I thought I'd just give you kind of weigh in as to where I'm coming from, and I'm hoping that Charlie, if I may, will do the same. And I do have a question for you, but if you'll bear with me as I give you a little preamble. So we also thought, because of my background and because of Charlie's, eminent, background and all of your work, that we'd probably be approaching this slightly differently. But we also hope that this will make for a very engaging conversation. So to talk a little bit about my doctoral research and kind of where I'm coming from this, my project overall considered 3 artists who were active in the interwar period, and those artists were Claude Cahin, Jeanne Mamen, and Paraskeva Clark. And while these artists were not personally connected, and nor did they have any, to my knowledge, knowledge of each other's works, there were several commonalities in their art and the conditions of their making. And so having a good foundation in the history of Canadian art, I of course knew Paraskeva Clark's work, namely Petrushka, which is this one right here from 1937. I'm hoping that most of you are pretty familiar with that. But it was really when I discovered her background in theater design that I realized that her practice could fit within the conceptual framework I was developing. And that framework was ultimately centered around theories of migratory aesthetics and marginality. And Paraskeva Clark's work served as a case study for me to consider how one could construct a feminist rewriting of Canadian art history, or perhaps to be a little more specific, a feminist rewriting of Ontario or Toronto art history, which would account for differences of nation and history. And so my starting point also was that by the time I started working on this, which really was roughly about 10 years ago actually, in 2005, 2006, that Clark had become, in spite of lots of good scholarship and exhibition history, that she had become a marginal figure in many ways, either in spite of or because of her efforts to merge avant-garde practice with leftist ideology. And I am indebted to Charlie for his groundbreaking study of Canadian art in the 1930s in the landmark exhibition from 1975, Canadian Painting in the 30s. And I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with this exhibition or the publication, which enjoys a very nice afterlife online. And I wanted to start there with my question, but I will still back up a tiny bit further, which was that, to sort of paraphrase Mary McLaughlin in this catalog here, because she begins her essay in that retrospective exhibition from 1982 entitled Paraskeva Clark Paintings and Drawings. She really opens the essay by saying that when myself, the painting, not me myself, but myself from 1933, which is alternately titled Woman in Black, and it appears on the recent biography from 2009. I don't think it's in color in there. That really this for her was a revelation. And so I really wanted to start by asking you why you decided to reproduce that painting as the cover image for your exhibition in 1975. And I was also hoping that you would share a little bit about your relationship to Paraskeva Clark's work, and of course, you knew Paraskeva Clark herself.
Yeah, I think that in the exhibition, some of the great discoveries for me was Paraskeva Clark and her work. And at that time, the National Gallery was able to acquire myself and Petrushka, and subsequently presence in Madrid. And I think that the show itself dealt with a sort of transition, what I call as a transition from a Toronto-based movement to a Montreal-based movement. And I saw that this, as this sort of interim movement of modernists in Toronto who really had an aesthetic doing somewhat more to what had happened in Montreal in the late 30s in the Contemporary Art Society, and what John Lyman wanted to promote in Canada. And certainly Paraskeva was one of those people, being European trained and with a European vision of art, she very much fit into that. There's something equally banal about it. It's a vertical book, and it's a vertical painting, so it worked on the cover. And, but it's also extremely powerful. I think the painting itself is so superb. You pointed out when we were talking earlier how at that point I was calling, I think, self-portrait, which is a title. She changed the title over time. So I took it in the loan form, or the acquisition form at that time, we called it self-portrait. But I think it's really the original title when she first exhibited in 33, which is so marvelous, myself. Here I am taking her leave. And that's what I think that her statement and her direct challenge, I think, in this portrait, depicts herself pregnant with her second son, and in a very sort of dynamic framework, and with a wonderful attitude. And I thought it just worked so strong as an image, and I can't think again, looking back, of anything in the show. And I haven't looked at this show for a long time, it was 75, and that I would think would have worked better. And certainly, as I say, she herself plays a particular role in the 30s because of her overt political commitment, which interestingly is just a very small part of her career. Her Russophile nationalism is something that continues right through, especially during the Second War, when Russia was so devastated. And she was very active with Russian support groups in Canada. But I think that her real political action is only a very small part of her work. And it really is the catalyst there, of course, is Norman Bethune. I'm pretty sure that that's really what is the catalyst. I think the sentiment was there. She was a woman who came from a working class family, educated working class family, but who had been able to study art in what became the free schools in Petrograd at that point. And she owed a great deal to, I think, to the revolution and the changes that it brought in society. And she was there and remained there at probably some of the more dynamic times in the revolution from an artistic point of view, which is the early 20s, before the hammer came down and the arts started to get suppressed. She also worked at the Maui Theatre. Her first love really was theatre. This is what she wanted to go into originally. That was only then she got into art, and then she worked at the Maui Theatre with her husband, Oreste Allegri, whose father was actually quite a noted designer who worked in Petrograd and in Paris. And the Maui Theatre was a centre of great experimentation, and she was working on set design there. So that this interest in theatre not only is in the manner and how she presents herself, and she was a very theatrical person. I mean, a lot of gesture, a lot of adamant statements, a lot of...
She used to sing. She used to sing.
She used to sing, but I think the theatrical element, and that was one of the things actually that interested me the most in your selection was these three watercolors here, designs for Eaton's windows on Yonge Street in Toronto, and which have a lot of elements of early 20th century Russian theater design in them. And this is, I think, something that obviously she's harking back to, and it's also a formal solution to the challenges of the project she was given, which is to do background designs for mannequin displays in a store window.
Right.
I'll give you one.
Okay. Well, I think I would actually disagree with you. I mean, I agree with you on one level about the politics, but in terms of the way I think of Paraskeva, I kind of think that a lot of what she did was politically engaged, but sort of small p politics, as opposed to the, Petrushka and and the Timbuk and all of these things. But getting back, I mean, since this was the springboard for this exhibition, were these working drawings. And I've said before that this actually, I wrote about this one in particular in the middle here with the jumping goat that looks a bit like Chagall-esque in my thesis in order to talk about exactly that she, came from this theatrical background, and this was a way for her to kind of get her foot in the door as a working artist and to meet other artists. And she was designing really, like you say, these sets as a backdrop. But the interesting thing about the windows and how they function to me to my mind, is that they were really public spaces, I think. And it was an event to go down and walk on Yonge Street and to see and be seen, and to kind of these interesting dynamics of identification, whether it was, you're of an affluent background or you weren't, you could, window displays are still designed in this way that you're meant to aspire to something or desire the objects, I think, that are on display. But for Paraskeva, I think as a working artist, she could put what she had learned in Russia into practice, and she also talked a lot about how this actually really gave her the courage to develop her own personal visual language as a way to, I think, fit into the community that she was really just learning to navigate and to, becoming exposed to. And I think I agree that she said, and you can see the resonances between the kinds of practices that were happening in Montreal, which were not quite the same as what was happening amongst the Toronto community of painters.
When did she start doing the windows?
And the first one, it was roughly 33, 34, around the same time that she painted myself. And actually, the first commission that Renee Serra, who was the designer at Eaton's, there seemed to be a little kind of cult around Renee Serra with Peggy Nicol, who I think introduced Paraskeva Clark to Renee Serra, who had been hired specifically by the Timothy Eaton's company to do the design work. He had worked at Galerie Lafayette, and he was familiar with Maison Dean, which is where Paraskeva had worked in Paris, and they spoke French to each other. So she was first commissioned to recreate a bathroom setting. So she painted bathroom tiles. And at the same time, she created that composition, which was one that she revisited many times. Because I think that one of the things that I've noticed throughout Paraskeva Clark's career was that the importance of memory and sort of nostalgia. And I wonder if being asked to recreate bathroom tiles spurred this memory of the Russian baths, and going with her mother and her sister to the bathhouses, which was also a very social space. And I believe that preparatory drawing, I'm not sure actually, because the dating, we were talking about this the other day, the dating is off and it's a bit tricky to map out, but she created a version of that composition in 1934, just after completing her first commission, which was exhibited at the Art Gallery of Toronto in an exhibition, I believe, that compared or pitted against, not pitted against, but put into conversation European modernist work with emerging Canadian work by artists like Carl Schaefer and Peggy Nicol, and this one was praised by the critics in, I believe, Saturday Night, that one needed not fear for the future of Canadian art, because with painters producing works such as that, there was a bright future ahead.
Well, I think the new Eaton store at Young College, the woman behind the decorations, I think, was Mrs. R.Y. Eaton, who was behind both for the Montreal store and the decorations for the restaurant and that store, and also for the Toronto store. They had the Margaret Eaton Music Hall, and it's a superb, it was to be a great Art Deco place. And the store itself dealt with a lot of Art Deco material, room furniture, silver, French Deco silver. So it was, but it's all, of course, in the late 20s, and the building was never finished because of the crash. But I think this was a perfect milieu for Paraskeva in some ways, because it was exactly the milieu which she had worked at Maison Dean in Paris. And this was an extremely avant-garde, very down to luxury objects, Art Deco objects. And so that, again, working with Renee Serra when he arrived, that was certainly a perfect milieu. So she, I think, at the same time as she's setting off, she's part of this milieu, and feels very comfortable there within that milieu. I don't know exactly what you mean by political, outside of the images themselves, beyond the tensions in her own identity as an artist, which can be read as political.
specifically as a woman artist and specifically as somebody outside, a sort of a new Canadian, not necessarily fitting in, but fitting in at the same time, and widely supported. But certainly, and again, to your other point about this transition and the aesthetics, that was something very much favoured by Graham McInnes, who came from Australia and who was a very a great promoter of the new art as opposed to the older artists that was still continuing from the 20s, namely specifically the group 7 landscape tradition.
Well, I suppose what I mean by political is that, I think living as an outsider in a kind of very bourgeois, this sort of tension that she had held these views, she had this kind of, this access to the Canadian art world through her husband, but there was a gender politics, I think, at play, which, I think has been overstated perhaps, but I think is also important that, just the fact that she was a working woman artist in a time when the Canadian art world was fairly male-dominated and not necessarily as open in the way that she sort of navigated, and really just stood up and said, this is myself, sort of take me or leave me, these are my politics, this is, she was living in a very, she lived with her in-laws, I believe, when she first moved to Canada, and they disapproved of, she was with a young, she had a son from a previous marriage, and the fact that she was harboring luck and communists. I'd heard stories of that, so sort of small ways that she kind of lived her life and worked, I think, are inherently political actions if they aren't necessarily political in that kind of larger sense. The fact that she was, obviously, eventually was very comfortable and she lived in an affluent, milieu, but she still sort of had these subtle ways of being quite subversive, I think, and that to me I found interesting, and I also think it connects to the avant-garde project, or the historical avant-garde project that perhaps I was actually going to ask you to talk a little bit more about your perception of the historical avant-garde and how that played out in Toronto, if it did, or what you think Paraskeva's connection to the historical avant-garde was or may have been.
But I think, I just go back on to your earlier statements, I don't think she was as isolated as, because there were other women artists in Toronto, I think McLaughlin, that's Hayworth, and a number of others who were working, certainly more women professional women working in Montreal at this time. And also, yes, I think she probably was quite uncomfortable living with her in-laws, but that didn't last very long. Well, again, of course, they must have disapproved of her husband, too, for marrying her. And it's to his credit that obviously he was a great supporter of her. But also that she lived in a very middle-class milieu, if not more, in Paris, with her in-laws there, or other in-laws, first set of in-laws. So that I don't think she was, yes, there was a constant tension in her own values, and she was having this inner debate with herself constantly, just out of which comes this great strength, I think, in her work. And I think Mary McLaughlin, in her foreword to this catalogue, outlines the contradictions in Clark's work very clearly, both being an insider and an outsider, wanting to be inside, wanting to be outside, and this constant debate, and how that tension really fed her work and her creativity. In terms of what the milieu I think she's obviously associated with in Toronto is really people like Milne, people like Charles Comfort, Carl Schaefer, and probably closest in some ways to Schaefer in terms of her non-political work, which is the bulk of her work is not politically engaged, overtly politically engaged. There's a very small number of works that are overtly politically engaged. And there's a lot of landscapes, and obviously a lot of portraits and self-portraits. And certainly through the self-portraits, there's this constant self-analysis. And that's again, get back to the 1933 self-portrait called Myself. And I think, as you say, it was very much a launch pad for herself in this milieu. And And she was, as I say, she really was supported by and welcomed by a lot of prominent artists in the city. But again, the women who could not be part of the Arts and Ladies Club and those other organizations. But see, again, this desire for her to be part of it and not part of it, she criticized the academy, the Rockname Academy constantly, but then of course accused them of discriminating against women. Do you want to be it or not want to be? And with Paraskeva, she wanted everything. So I think that the milieu, certainly her formal concerns, her debt to Cézanne, Petrov Vodka, obviously, her teacher in Petrograd, is enormous, and those continue to be her prime concerns. And it really fuels this particular formal language, which you see in most of the works here, be it the nudes, be it the landscape there, this sort of angularity, this tension in her work, which I think is really very strong and has a lot of impact. So that I think that, yes, because so many, I think many of the artists in Toronto were really looking at what was happening in Montreal as a way of breaking out of a tradition that was really largely dead, as to breed new ideas. I think a number of the Toronto artists who were the members of Group 7 continued to produce very strong works. Paris had to leave the city to do it. But I think that nonetheless it was dead as the tradition had been milked. And it was not an example for the new directions.
If I can pick up on your point about self-portraiture, because I think it's an important one. I mean, Paraskeva Clark did have a sustained practice of self-portraiture, which, as you rightly point out, I think up until for about a period of, I think, 25 years. The first one is from 23 or 25, and she's for
self-concept programs.
47.
Is it 47? Okay.
Yes, or 42. Might be 42. I think it's 42. Somewhere, so let's say roughly 25 years, give or take a few, 42. But do you see, I mean, I did not show a self-portrait in this exhibition, although I do feel that we are very much surrounded by Paraskeva Clark in this exhibition. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about reading any of these portraits as other forms of self-portraiture.
I think you could say that about most artists, that it becomes the world they live in, and it's articulated in a visual way. And certainly, you talked about memory. Again, the whole memory thing is belonging and not belonging, and harking back to her experiences in Russia and her longing for Russia. And she had two breaks in her life. She first, after her husband drowned on the eve of their departure from Russia, to join his parents, who had already moved to Paris. Obviously, the situation was becoming trickier in Petrograd, and he drowned. So she left with her young son and joined her in-laws in Paris. And then, so there's the Paris period, and then the curious thing is, what was the motivation to marry a Canadian whom she didn't really know? And somebody who had kind of been a customer in the store and who had correspondence. But I presume, obviously it was as much to get away from something as to be attracted to something. And she came to Canada, and that took a lot of guts, I think, to do that, and to move into this milieu, unknown milieu. Certainly Philip was somebody who was involved in the arts indirectly. Friends, his closest friends were musicians of the Hart House Quartet. And but also that he was a member of the Arts and Ladies Club, so that milieu, those friendships also facilitated her entry into the milieu. It's not as if she was completely on the outside. But no, definitely the world you see in Paraskeva's paintings is Paraskeva's work, and it's Paraskeva. And very much, again, the harking back to the Russian, be it looking at the new countries he's in over here, but again, how she sees the landscape is a very different formal language than most of the other artists. Again, I think in some ways she's closest to Carl Schaefer, without that longing you find in Schaefer's work. But definitely, I think it's that this is all about self-portrait. But I mean, it's a very different type of self-portrait than the ones in which she depicts herself.
Right. No, I would agree. And I read this one behind me as a self-portrait for some of the reasons that you mentioned. I mean, we've got the violin with you could read that as representing Murray Daskin, which is he was very integral in Paraskeva coming to Canada. He's the one that effectively persuaded Philip to go back to Maison DIM and ask her on a date, to which she said no, by the way. And you have the hands. Paraskeva had very, very large hands, and these elegant gloves. She really did like to kind of dress up and play her part. And I was thinking actually that we should probably mention his name. We should talk about Petro Vodkin and his influence on her, because it is quite particular. And it does resonate in a few of these, more than a few of the works in this room. So I'm going to actually hand the mic over to you if you know a little bit about how, I mean, he was focused on geometry and imagination, but he had a very particular way of composing images, did he not? And I was wondering if you could just...
Well, without illustration, it's a bit difficult, but you
Yes.
do see some of it in the bathhouse painting. It's probably the one that shows it most in this, is that way of angularity, creating energy through use of angles, and people are always off a bit askew. Certainly he grew out of admiration for Cézanne and the Cubists, but at the same time he would have been a fairly conservative artist in the Russian milieu at this time, a representational artist treating folk themes, as did some of the early modernists like Goncharova and but definitely it's a representational art made modern mostly by the angularity of the images and the juxtaposition of the images. And he again often uses those lines and breaks in the composition to animate the surface. So I wish I'd known I had some postcards of his work. I should have brought them, sorry. But I think this is something she learned from Petrov Vodkin, and as something that really was a very dynamic element of her own art.
Well, I'd like to bring us back to, again, the two still lifes in here. And link to that one over there in the corner is called Still Life with Alabaster and Grapes. And the one behind me is just called Still Life. But so many art historians and philosophers have denigrated still life as the lowest grade of artistic endeavor, the last refuge for those who lack the skill to succeed in history painting, portraiture, or landscape painting. And the history of the genre is often positioned as also being very self-involved, immoral, degraded, the stuff of students, hacks, and Sunday painters. But I've actually talked about Paraskeva's still lifes, and one of them you mentioned earlier, Presents from Madrid. But I've talked about them, instead of thinking of these as still lives, as a form of montage, in terms of using strategies of repetition and overlap and combination, which is actually also very keyed into commercial art and advertising and design, even department stores like Eaton's actually use techniques of montage in their advertisements in newspapers. And I was wondering, well, I often get picked up, actually, I'll start this way, by talking about still lives as montage. But I mean, I do really see that with Presents from Madrid, which was dismissed as as a combination of knickknacks that were put together by critics, where of course in that one, I think she really was referencing the Spanish Civil War, but I also see similar kind of formal techniques that are in operation in this painting, and perhaps to a lesser degree in that still life, but it's certainly along the same lines of Petrov Vodkin and his way of composing to really get viewers to look at banal kind of everyday things in a different way, so that we could start to think differently. And for me, that's where a lot of the kind of political elements of Paraskeva Clark, even though they aren't overt. There is the potential, anyways, for something radical or different and political to take place if you are looking at objects anew.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite obvious that the presence from Madrid, which I don't know if people want to just take this around. There's an image of it, sorry. The one there. Which is a still life that she composed of elements that Norman Bethune had sent her, which was a page from a Spanish medieval missal, the cap of the Republican front in Spain. Of course, Bethune had gone to Spain to support the medical support for introduced transfusion system, ambulance transfusion systems for the Republican army in Spain. And so these he sent back to her, and she made the still life, so it's very overtly, everybody knew what they were. Sorry, I should be using this. Everybody knows exactly what the elements were, so the statement is very obvious. And when the papers are covered with news of the Spanish Civil War, which was, even then, you can see clearly seen as a fight between fascism and, if not communism, republicanism. And so that, but certainly the way she composes them is certainly, I think, very unusual. I mean, it's not actually a still life to say. It's an arrangement, as you say, possibly montage. In the work over here, I think what's marvelous over here in the still life of the alabaster and grapes is the presence of the bane of every art student of the 40s and 50s is a wicker-covered Chianti bottle. And how many bad paintings have been done with that? Here she makes it into a much more dynamic composition, again through that angularity and that arrangement, which is derived from Petra and makes it into a much more interesting painting, in which, and of course by placing the alabaster bowl and the grapes in the middle and shutting aside the Chianti bottle, she makes it again, as I say, a much more interesting painting. So still life, I disagree wholeheartedly with say. I mean, it's just think of so many artists who painted still lives. They're just resonant with humanity, or resonant with vision, resonant with symbolism. They all the different elements operate on that. And of course, even just the choice of subject matter, or object matter, is extremely important. And with presence in Madrid, of course, it's key to our understanding of what she wanted to do. And it's, I guess, one of the very few. That small group of things that are overtly political and politically engaged.
There's about 3. Maybe, well, there's more than 3. There's
well, Mao, which has disappeared, the portrait of Mao.
There's one that's in Russia, that which I found very briefly on the internet, and it's stupidly took a screenshot, but she sent it as part of...
In the Soviet support?
Yes.
I've never seen it.
Yeah. There's the... Yes, well, there's it's a painting of people riding the Toronto streetcar, reading about one of the Russian campaigns of I think it was the siege of Leningrad, I think it was, and she sent that. So there is an image of Canadians reading about the news, and you can see, that it's not a montage or a collage in a kind of Picasso type sense, but this painting does exist, and I tried to track it down. There's the other sort of political cartoons that she did, the Toronto's Good. They are satirical. And there actually is a sort of, she's making a lot of comments on sort of that social realist and that kind of way about the effects of the Depression and homelessness and hunger. And there is an example of that, which is in the Firestone collection. But I did not purposely want to put it in this room because she is so known for this work that's connected to sort of social and political causes, so I put it next door. I think we should open it up to questions. Please. But I did want to say, though, by ending with this concept of still life, because I completely agree with you, but it's I'm going to point to this painting behind me. It's a particularly important one to me. because it happens to be my inheritance. It is in my parents' actually, but we decided, so this is why, I mean, we decided it was called, it has no title. This was originally in the Eaton's College store, and it is one of, these are the only two that I know of that have survived from the work that she produced. You've got 3 working drawings, and then these two paintings from a very lesser known aspect of her working life in Canada. But we decided after all these kinds of conversations about still lives and that we should really rename it Still Moving. It really actually isn't still at all, as you pointed out with the still life with Chianti and grapes. So yeah, I think we'll open it up for questions.
I have one. So a word that I haven't heard in your conversation is feminism. And I'm wondering if, one, Paraskeva Clark identified as a feminist, or if, in a larger context, second part of the question, did she go outside of Toronto for influences, like, let's say, Montreal and the Beaver Hall Hill group, and the community of women artists that existed in Quebec versus the one in Toronto where she immigrated to? So that sort of, I guess what I'm asking was there an influence of a feminist aesthetic, dare I say that, that has been associated to her work or her career?
Well, since I'm holding the microphone, I would take issue with the formulation of a feminist aesthetic for starters.
It's that way of saying that.
But I mean, she was certainly aware of and she lectured on work produced by women, and she was very connected. But I mean, I think with feminism, the mistake that's often made is that there are 2 genders. I'm not always all that comfortable with talking about women's art as women's art, something that is inherently specific to any individual, purely based on something that is a socially constructed category. But to speak to your, I mean, I will actually let you answer whether you think Paraskeva Clark was a feminist, but part of the reason I wanted to start with myself and pointing to what I think was a very important gesture for a lot of art historians and curators of my generation is that, I mean, I think a lot of us, this painting, because you put it on the cover, has had a very interesting effect, or ripple effect, but I'm not sure, I don't know if you're aware of it, but this myself has cropped up in all kinds of studies and in all kinds of contexts, and I think had you not put that painting on the cover, I mean, you really did start something by doing that, in that I think that there are a generation of art historians and curators, Jacqueline and myself, I think are part of that, that really kind of look to Paraskeva as our feminist grandmother in the history of Canadian art. So whether or not I think she would like, to be thought of as a feminist, but I'm not sure, in terms of second wave, first wave feminism, how she, or if she would have found any kind of affinity or made any sort of identification with that political movement.
Well, I guess my first reaction when you ask the question is the answer to most questions about Paraskeva is yes and no. Yes, I think she was a feminist insofar as she insisted that she was going to be an artist, she was going to have a career, a public career. She was ambitious for herself as a career, but also full of self-doubt, which is common to many artists. She's somebody, as I mentioned, in terms of the Academy, she was very critical of the Academy for not electing female members. She certainly also felt very bound and responsible as a mother, and family was very important to her, and had, in some ways, a limiting effect on her career, especially after her son was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that took an enormous amount of time in her life. And so, yes, I think she would identify with women who are pursuing careers and see themselves as equals. Relationship to Montreal artists, she's of a different generation from the so-called Beaver Hall artists, But her one friend, well, two friends, I guess, Peggy Nichol was in Montreal, then moved to Toronto, and then moved to New York, originally from Ottawa. And through Peggy, she met Marion Scott. Marion Scott was also a friend of Norman Bethune, so there was that connection, but I don't think she never spent any time in Montreal, as far as I know. So no, the friendships were very much within the geographical milieu in which she lived. But yes, I think definitely I see her as a feminist in the sense that myself, take me or leave me. And if you leave me, that's fine too. But she wanted recognition at the same time, you know, all the other things that come with that. I don't think she would have necessarily wanted. I get back to the preface in this catalogue by Marion Rothman, and I think maybe I should read it sort of briefly. So, thanks very much. It's just a sort of a sorry.
Certainly she lived a life of active commitment, studied leftist literature, and called herself a socialist, yet her political opinions, like her views on women or Canadian art, contain great contradictions. These contradictions seem to be an integral part of her character. The committed activist, proud of her Russian peasant heritage, could in turn become an elegant sophisticate who loved parties and fashionable clothes. While she spoke out on behalf of women painters, she believed they were biologically incapable of producing truly powerful work in the plastic arts. She railed against the isolationism of Canadian society, yet she was